A 1.5-inch scale Allchin Royal Chester traction engine renovation. Part 8. Painting more parts of the engine, refitting the rear wheels and running the engine on the bench. Normally in my videos I will show clips of paint drying at the end of the video, but just for a change, here's a clip of the paint drying right at the beginning of the video. This is the trunk guide that supports the crosshead, and this is the second coat of paint. This part of the engine is very important because it's right at the top and it's the first thing anyone's going to see when they look at the engine, and the original touch-up job on the damaged paint looked terrible. After this paint's dried, I will rub it down and give it a final top coat. This is a very important part. It's the bit that drives the wheels. It's keyed to the axle and pinned to one of the wheels. The drive pins at this side are not removable. The ones at the other side are, so you can disengage the wheel to use the winch. I had a good look over the engine in the area where I was going to fit the rear wheels, and I realised I'd forgotten to touch in some of the paint on the side, so before fitting the rear wheels I'm making sure it's okay. I also need to paint the rim of the flywheel, and for this I'm using some special paint. It's called Sign Painter's One Shot, and it's really designed for sign writing. It has a lot more pigment in it than most paints. This can's been stood on the shelf for a while, so it needs a really good stir. I'll speed up the process using my old toothbrush handle. The video footage is running at 4 times normal speed to get through this sequence quickly. The viscosity of this paint is quite a lot thinner than some other paints that I use. That's because it's designed to flow and cover in one coat. Around the edge of this flywheel though, I do think it's going to need another coat. Once the paint is dried and hardened, I'll rub it down and give it a second coat. The time has come to refit the blowdown valve. I'm coating the thread in Loctite 542 to seal it. This thread is not a very tight fit in the boiler, and it was leaking slightly, but the Loctite 542 will fix this. I'm locking it into position using a large spanner. Just because I'm using a large spanner doesn't mean that I'm going to over-tighten it and shear it off. When working on miniatures, you need a firm but gentle, delicate touch. After smearing some grease on the axle, I slid the driving block into place. Because this part is keyed to the axle and doesn't move, it didn't really need the grease, but I thought it was a good idea to prevent it from going rusty and sticking firmly in place. This clip shows the 2 driving pins in the holes at the back of the wheel. Now it's time to fit the wheel to the axle. Another coating of grease to help waterproof the parts, which I do recommend if you're reassembling engines that are going to be running where there's likely to be water. I mentioned to the owner that I couldn't guarantee the boiler, nor could I test it. I cannot issue certificates. But just in case this owner or any future owner decides to run the engine on steam, this waterproofing method is a good idea. Fitting the wheel turned out to be more difficult than I thought. The driving pins would only fit into the driving block in one position. Here I'm using a hammer extremely gently to tap the wheel into the correct position so I can insert the pin through the collar. Normally disassembly is the problem. Reassembly is usually easy, but it was the reverse way round on this engine. After applying a bit more grease to the end of the axle, I fitted the collar and inserted the pin. The pin went almost all the way in by finger pressure alone, but to get it into the final position I did have to tap it with the hammer once again very gently. Fitting the hubcaps was a simple yet fiddly job. This is the first one I dismantled, and it's the one that has a stud that is broken off. 2 of these hubcap fixing studs are broken, one on each hubcap at either side of the engine. And in this clip you can see that I've forgotten to put the nut on the dummy stud that stuck out of the hubcap. It's at the bottom right. I only noticed the missing nut in the video edit, and now as you can see I've turned the engine round to fit the other wheel. This axle needs a copious amount of grease. That's because when using the winch, the axle rotates freely in the bearing on the wheel. I was a bit puzzled by this. I had to fit the collar the other way around, because the securing pin didn't fit through the holes in the centre when I refitted the collar as it was originally the other way around. It's not important though, it's securely back together. And here once again I'm tightening the nuts that are fixed to the studs on the other side, and the wheel now rotates very freely because the drive pins aren't in place. Here are the pair of removable drive pins. I've cleaned one of them and the other one is just as it was when I took it off the engine. I don't want to polish these up. They wouldn't have been polished. They just need to be like clean steel. Both of these drive pins have a small fitting which allows them to be locked in position, because most of the time these drive pins actually drive the engine. The only reason you would have to remove them is if you wanted to use the winch. In this clip I'm showing how the drive pins are held in place with two special fittings and two flat split pins. I found it quite difficult to fit these two split pins because there wasn't much tolerance in the slot, but I got there in the end. Here I'm using a small screwdriver blade to just open the split pins to stop them falling out. It's time now to run the engine to make sure everything's okay and nothing falls off. As you can clearly see, this wheel is going round, the other one isn't at the other side because of the differential. To make sure everything was okay, I ran the engine up and down the bench. There's plenty of power at this wheel, and even running up and down the bench in this restricted space, the engine was very responsive in both directions. There was a problem with this lubricator. The check valve on it was blowing back, and I thought that if I put some standard lubricating oil in the lubricator, that means lubricating oil, not cylinder steam oil, which is very thick, the logic being that the thinner oil should unstick the valve, and indeed it has done. The lubricator is working perfectly, which is more than it did a few days ago. So that is it for this episode. I'd like to say, as I always do, stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.